Jacob Hale was 42 years old, and he believed, truly believed, that a man who builds with his hands and keeps his word never has to look over his shoulder. He had calloused palms, a quiet voice, a company he'd grown from a single truck and a prayer into one of the most respected small construction firms in Phoenix, Arizona. He built homes for families in his community, real homes, with solid foundations, on land they could be proud of. And for 9 years, he believed he had built something just as solid with Kalani, his wife. Sharp, beautiful, warm when she wanted to be. He was proud of her. He told people that too. Then one Friday evening, a bottle of perfume he didn't recognize changed everything. Not loudly, not with a scene, just quietly, the way the most dangerous things always begin. What Jacob was about to discover that night wouldn't just break his heart. It would unravel 32 months of lies, a $180,000 theft from his own company, and a betrayal by the one man he'd called a brother. And by the time the truth came fully to light, it would happen in front of everyone. Before we get into the story, if you've ever loved someone completely and quietly wondered whether they still saw you the same way, stay with me. Because this one is going to hit close to home. It was a Friday. Late August, the way Phoenix gets in late August. The kind of heat that doesn't let go even after sundown, when the asphalt still radiates warmth through the soles of your shoes, and the air smells faintly of dry earth and cooling concrete. Jacob had come home at 6, which was early for him. He'd showered, reheated the leftover chicken his sister Elena had dropped off the day before, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea and a set of project blueprints spread out in front of him. The ceiling fan clicked softly overhead. It had been doing that for 2 years, and he kept meaning to fix it. The house was quiet in that comfortable, lived-in way that a man can mistake for permanence. Then Kalani walked out of the bedroom. She had on a fitted black dress. Her warm brown skin caught the soft yellow light from the hallway, and she looked, as she always did when she made the effort, genuinely stunning. She was spraying perfume at her wrist, something citrus on top, sweet vanilla underneath. Something Jacob had never smelled before. Not the bottle he'd given her at Christmas. Not anything from their bathroom shelf. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Casual, no edge to it. "Jade's birthday," she said, meeting his eyes in the hallway mirror. She smiled at him through the reflection. "Damien might be there. He's just a friend, babe. Don't overthink it." Jacob nodded. He smiled back. But something in the pit of his stomach didn't follow the smile. It stayed right where it was, still and attentive, the way a man gets when he's been around enough unstable ground to know the feeling before the crack appears. He watched her pick up the keys to the Mercedes, the one he'd saved for quietly over 8 months and surprised her with on their anniversary. A Saturday morning, a big red bow, her hand over her mouth. She'd cried that day. He had felt, in that moment, more like a husband than he ever had in his life. She left at 7:14. He knows the time because he checked the microwave clock. He sat back down with his iced tea. He looked at the blueprints. He stared at them for about 12 minutes without seeing a single line. Then he folded them up, set his glass in the sink, and grabbed the keys to his work truck. The old one, with the cracked side mirror and the faded Phoenix Hale construction decal on the rear window. He followed her, not in anger. He would be clear about that later, when he had to tell this story more than once. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't rehearsing an argument. He was simply a man who had spent 20 years reading foundations, who knew, by instinct and long experience, when something underneath wasn't level. He gave her a 12-minute head start. Kalani didn't go to any restaurant. She drove straight to a luxury apartment complex in Scottsdale. Glass facade, polished lobby visible from the parking lot. The kind of building where the landscaping looks like it gets watered twice daily. She pulled into the covered lot without hesitation, walked through the main entrance, and held a key fob up to the elevator panel. Her own key fob, already in her hand. No buzzing up, no waiting for anyone. She stepped in. The elevator doors closed. Jacob sat across the street in the darkness, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The desert heat pressed against the windows. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler system clicked on and swept across a strip of grass. He watched the lobby lights. He didn't move. He wasn't going to storm the building. He wasn't going to call her. He had no interest in a scene that would cost him everything he needed to know. He simply sat in the dark and let the weight of what he was seeing settle into him slowly. The way a crack in a foundation settles, quiet and invisible, until one day, suddenly, it isn't. After a while, he started the truck and drove home. He reheated nothing. He sat on the back porch in the dark until nearly midnight, listening to the desert go quiet, and he began to think with the same patience he brought to every difficult build. He would not tear anything down. Not yet. Not until he understood exactly what he was looking at. But what he was about to discover would hurt far more than the affair itself, and it would change everything he thought he had built. Stay with me, because in the next part, Jacob starts pulling on the thread, and what unravels goes all the way back nearly 3 years before that Friday night. The next morning, Jacob made coffee, kissed Kalani on the cheek, and asked how Jade's birthday was. "So fun," she said, reaching past him for the creamer. "You would have been bored." "Probably," he said. He smiled. He meant none of it. He was on the phone with Victoria Kane before he reached the job site. Victoria came recommended through a lawyer in his network, a professional investigator in her early 50s who drove an unremarkable gray sedan and charged a flat rate that Jacob would later consider the best money he ever spent. She was methodical. She didn't editorialize. The first time they met, she told him, "Mr. Hale, I find what's there. I don't find what isn't. You want the truth? I'll get it." He told her he did. So Jacob Hale became, for a while, 2 men at once. By day, he was the model husband, home on time, asking about her week, driving to the garden supply store on a Saturday for a specific fertilizer Kalani had mentioned once in passing for the potted ficus on the back porch. He fixed the backyard fence one evening by garage light, hammer falling in steady rhythm while the neighborhood slept. His neighbor Harold leaned over the fence at some point and said, "You know it's 10:30, right?" Jacob laughed softly and kept going, but in the quiet hours, he was doing the kind of accounting that a man does when he suspects the blueprint he's been building from was wrong from the start. He thought about missed signals, reread old text messages, turned over memories the way you turn over a stone that's been sitting flush in the ground for so long, it left an impression. "I build houses for others with sweat," he thought one night in the garage, sitting on an overturned bucket with a warm ginger ale going flat in his hand, never realizing my own foundation had been cracking. Victoria delivered her first report in 8 days. Plain envelope. The luxury complex in Scottsdale, Unit 1402, registered to one Damian Cross, age 35, a commercial real estate investor. Kalani had entered and exited the building 4 times in 10 days. Key fob access confirmed each time. And then the line that stopped him cold. The relationship between Kalani and Damian Cross had been ongoing for 32 months. Jacob read that number twice. set the envelope on his workbench, picked it up, and read it a third time. 32 months. He walked inside, opened the junk drawer in the hall table, and found near the back what he was looking for. A receipt from a jewelry store in Sedona. 2.5 years ago, a silver necklace he'd bought because he'd overheard Kalani admire it in a shop window during a weekend trip. He hadn't even been sure she'd seen him notice. He paid cash, wrapped it in tissue paper from the hotel gift shop, gave it to her over dinner. She had hugged him in the middle of the restaurant, voice muffled against his shoulder. "You always know exactly what I need." He had been so proud of that moment. He'd told Elena about it afterward. He now understood that Kalani had already been involved with Damien Cross for 3 months when he handed her that necklace. When she cried. He set the receipt flat on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. The ceiling fan clicked overhead. He didn't throw anything. He didn't make a call. He just looked at that small piece of paper and let himself understand, fully and without softening it, exactly what it meant. Then he went back to work. The second report from Victoria arrived 10 days later, and this one was heavier in a different way. In the 3rd year of their marriage, Kalani had worked part-time handling the company's books, invoicing, payroll, vendor scheduling. She was organized and efficient, and Jacob had added her as an authorized signer on the business account, as a practical matter. She was his wife. Of course he trusted her. Victoria's financial review told a different story. Over a span of 14 months, Kalani had made a series of carefully timed transfers from the company account. Amounts calibrated to stay below reporting thresholds, spaced between busy stretches when Jacob's attention was on contracts and crews and deadlines. The total was $180,000. The transfers didn't go to household expenses or personal accounts that Jacob could track. They went, along with matching funds from Damien Cross, toward the purchase of a Scottsdale property. Victoria's notes included a phrase pulled from an email exchange between Kalani and Damien. The phrase was, "Building a new future." Jacob read that and set the report face down on the workbench. He stood there in the garage for several minutes without moving. He thought about every Saturday he'd given up, every contract he'd chased, every dollar he'd reinvested rather than spent because he was building something that was supposed to outlast the grind. He thought about the families living in homes he'd constructed. He thought about every employee he'd paid on time, without fail, no matter what that required of him personally. $180,000. He picked up his phone and left a message for Nathan Cole, the best contract attorney in Phoenix. Then came the thing that hurt in a different register entirely. The third piece of Victoria's report contained a name Jacob already knew well. Ryan Brooks, Kalani's younger brother. 29. Loud at cookouts, always short on hot sauce. The kind of man who told the same 3 stories at every family gathering and somehow got a laugh each time. Jacob had genuinely liked Ryan. 2 years earlier, he'd written the recommendation letter that helped Ryan obtain his contractor's license. He'd done it without being asked. Ryan had accepted $15,000 in so-called consulting fees from Damien Cross, paid across 2 installments. In exchange, he had stayed quiet. He had been aware of the affair and the financial arrangement for 14 months. He had sat across from Jacob at Sunday dinners, Thanksgiving tables, and Easter plates, and had said nothing. Not once. The following Sunday, Jacob went to the Brooks family dinner as usual. Good food, basketball on in the living room, Vivian's kitchen warm and fragrant. Ryan was louder than usual that afternoon, working through some long story about a breakdown on I-10 that had everyone chuckling. He did not meet Jacob's eyes a single time. Jacob watched him the way he watched a structure for stress fractures. Patient, still, unhurried. He understood now. The man he had treated like a brother had weighed him against $15,000 and made his choice without apparent difficulty. Jacob drove home slowly that evening under the wide Arizona sky. He sat in the truck in his own driveway for a few minutes before going inside. He had everything Victoria was going to find. He had Nathan Cole's number. He had a clear picture of what had been done and by whom. Now he needed a room where all of it could be said out loud, not for his own satisfaction, but because some truths are too large to be handled in private. They need air and witnesses and the particular weight of a community's presence. The Black Phoenix Housing Fund Gala was 3 weeks away, a major charity event supporting affordable housing across Phoenix's black neighborhoods. Damian Cross was listed as a primary sponsor. Jacob had been invited to participate as a respected contractor. He called the organizer the next morning and reserved a table. He had some invitations to send. Jacob was building something in the dark now, not with lumber and nails, but with patience and paperwork. And the night of that gala was about to become one that nobody in that room would ever forget. In the 2 weeks before the gala, Jacob made 2 phone calls that nobody knew about. The first was to the venue manager, a quiet arrangement for a private lounge off the main hall, available for roughly 45 minutes mid-evening. The second was to Nathan Cole, who confirmed that a specific set of documents would be ready to carry into that room. Jacob asked Elena to be there. He told her only what she needed to know, and she asked him no questions. She showed up the evening of the gala with a leather folder tucked under her arm and said, "Tell me where to stand." He said, "Near the door." She nodded. That was the whole conversation. The night of the Black Phoenix Housing Fund Gala, the weather had softened the way Phoenix occasionally does in early autumn. The heat still present but gentler, as if the desert itself had exhaled. The venue was a downtown hotel with high ceilings and warm lighting, the kind of room that made everyone look a little more polished than they were. A live jazz quartet worked through something slow and clarinet-heavy in the corner, and there were white linen tables and flowers, and the particular warmth that fills a space when a community gathers around something it genuinely believes in. Jacob walked in with Kalani on his arm. She was wearing red, a different perfume tonight, something warmer. She smiled at people she recognized, accepted compliments gracefully, tucked herself close to Jacob's side the way a wife does when she wants to look like one. She had no idea. Jacob wore his best suit, pressed, unhurried. He shook hands with men he respected, nodded to contractors he'd worked alongside for years, exchanged a word with Vivian and Richard Brooks near the entrance. Kalani's parents, dressed well, genuinely pleased to be there. Elena was already at their sponsored table, posture upright, folder on her lap. Victoria Kane was present too, near the back of the room, quiet and unremarkable in the way she always was. Damian Cross arrived 20 minutes in. He was handsome, the kind of polished that came from good clothes and practiced ease. He was holding a champagne flute and laughing at something as he crossed the room, completely at home in his own event. He caught Kalani's eye from across the space. Something moved between them. Brief, reflexive, the kind of exchange that a husband only registers if he's been watching carefully. Jacob had been watching carefully for weeks. Earlier that day, he had sent Damian a single text message. Private lounge, side corridor, 8 p.m. Come alone. I know everything. You'll want to hear what I say before I say it publicly. He had not expected to need to send it twice. Men like Damian Cross, in Jacob's experience, always believed they could manage a conversation in their favor. He gave it until 8 o'clock. Let Kalani relax into the evening. Let her accept a drink and exchange pleasantries, and begin to feel that this was simply another night. Then he touched her arm lightly and said, "Come with me for a minute. I want to show you something." She came without suspicion. Why wouldn't she? The private lounge was just past the corridor with the tall mirrors. When Kalani walked in, she found Ryan already seated, his parents on either side of him. Vivian with the tightly controlled expression of a woman bracing for impact. Richard very still. Elena stood near the door as instructed. Victoria was positioned to one side, and Damien Cross was there, because he had come, exactly as Jacob expected. The door closed. Kalani looked at Jacob. Her expression began the slow work of calculation, trying to read the room, measure the distance between where she stood and what she was facing. "Jacob," she said, light and careful. "What is this?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at everyone present, slowly, without hurry. Vivian, Richard, Ryan, who was studying the carpet, Elena, who gave him a small nod when his eyes reached her. Then he turned back to his wife. "Scottsdale Residences," he said. "Unit 1402. Your own key fob. 4 visits in 10 days that I witnessed personally." He held her gaze. 32 months, Kalani. The color left her face. "I know about the Sedona trip," he continued, his voice remaining level. "The silver necklace. You were already 3 months into this when I gave you that gift. When you hugged me in the middle of that restaurant." He paused. "I needed that said out loud, in front of the people who love us, and the ones who should have said something themselves." He turned to Ryan. The room became very still. "Ryan." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. "You accepted $15,000 across 2 payments to stay quiet for 14 months. He reached into his jacket and placed a folded bank statement on the table in front of Ryan. 2 transfers from Damien Cross's account, 3 months apart. Ryan Brooks as the receiving party. "You sat at my table. You ate food I bought. You watched me work and said nothing." Ryan's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Then Vivian made a sound. It was not a cry exactly. It was the sound a woman makes when something she built, or believed she built, fails in a way that cannot be quietly repaired. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at her son. Vivian was a strong woman. She had been a deacon's wife for 30 years, ran the church food pantry, organized the community bazaar every spring. Grandchildren called her on Sundays. She was not a woman who fell apart. But she looked at Ryan now with an expression that Jacob had never seen on her face in 9 years of Sunday dinners, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My son," she said, "how could you do this to a man this family called its own?" Ryan opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, just that word, and it was enough. Richard put his hand on her arm and said nothing at all. He was a quiet man by nature, Richard Brooks, a retired postal worker who had built his entire life around decency. He did not look at Ryan again for the rest of the evening. Damien Cross had not moved from the spot where he'd entered. He was still holding the champagne flute, Jacob noticed, except now his grip on it had gone slightly rigid, the stem trembling just enough to see if you were looking. Jacob looked at him. "I'm not here for you specifically," he said. "What was done will be addressed through legal channels, and my attorney is already prepared. But I wanted you in this room to witness what I'm about to say to my wife, and to understand that what you and she have been calling a private arrangement is now a matter of documented record." He turned back to Kalani. She had gone very still. Her arms were wrapped tight across her chest. The composure that had carried her through 9 years, through gifts and dinners and occasions where she had performed the role of devoted wife, with what Jacob now recognized as considerable skill, that composure had come apart in the last few minutes, and what was underneath it looked like a woman who had walked confidently out onto ice and just heard it crack beneath her. "Jacob," she said. Her voice broke on the second syllable. "Please, let me explain." "I'm not here in anger," he said. And it was true. That was, perhaps, the most disorienting thing in the room, that his voice contained no rage. "I'm not standing here to humiliate you. I'm standing here because I needed this to be real." Said out loud, in a room where it cannot be undone or quietly rewritten. He straightened his jacket. "I built this company from the ground up. Every contract, every payroll, every Saturday I gave up." He let that sit for a moment. "I built it with the intention that it would outlast the grind, that it would mean something. I am not here to destroy anything tonight." He held her eyes. "I am here to protect what I built." He nodded once to Elena. She picked up the folder. They walked to the door together. Outside, the jazz was still playing, something brighter now, almost joyful. The main hall hummed with voices and laughter, completely unaware. Jacob paused in the corridor. He pressed one hand briefly to the wall, just for a second. Then he straightened and walked toward the lobby. Behind him, through the closed lounge door, he could hear Vivian's voice again, low and measured, and carrying the particular weight that only arrives in a mother's voice when she has run entirely out of excuses to make for someone she loves. He did not stop to listen. He had heard enough for one night. What Jacob carries out of that hotel will close every exit Kalani thought she had left open, and what he reveals next will show just how carefully and how completely she had planned to take everything he built. Here is the part that no one in that private lounge had been prepared for. Not Vivian, not Richard, not even Elena, who knew more than most and still went quiet when she heard it laid out completely. Because what Jacob had shown them in the first part of that conversation, the affair, the 14 months of silence, the money paid for someone's complicity, that was the wound. Painful and clear. But what came next was the structure beneath the wound, the part that had been designed. He reached into Elena's folder. He set 2 documents on the table side by side, neat and deliberate. The first was a printed email thread, 17 messages between Kalani and Damian Cross, spanning 8 months. Jacob didn't read from it aloud. He turned it so the room could see the subject line of the most recent message, dated 6 weeks earlier. Divorce timeline plus asset split. Kalani's breath caught, audible across the room. "You were already planning it," Jacob said. Flat, factual. 14 months in, you were already mapping the exit. He rested 2 fingers lightly on the email printout. "Arizona is a community property state. You both understood that. 50% of Phoenix Hail construction at current valuation would represent a significant settlement. Damian's real estate network would absorb the business cleanly." He paused. "You were going to call it an amicable separation. You were going to let me believe it was mutual." Vivian closed her eyes. "There's a line in here," Jacob continued, "written to him 18 months ago." He found the page and turned it toward Kalani without touching her. Near the bottom, in her own words, the sentence read clearly. He didn't say it aloud. He let her read it herself. She had written, "Jacob is just the old foundation. I need an upgrade." The word sat in the room the way a stone sits after it's been dropped. the ripple moving outward in all directions, reaching everyone at slightly different moments. Richard Brooks pressed both hands flat on the table and stared straight ahead. He did not speak. He was a man who had spent 35 years at the post office sorting other people's correspondence, and he had never, in all those years, read anyone else's mail. Now he wished he could unsee what was in front of him. Damien Cross still hadn't spoken. He stood near the window with his champagne flute, and Jacob noticed his grip on it had tightened to the point that his knuckles had changed color. Kalani started to say something. Jacob set the second document in front of her. She looked down. Her face moved through confusion, then recognition, then something that arrived slowly. The expression of a person understanding, all at once and without the mercy of gradualness, exactly how thoroughly they had miscalculated. It was a post-nuptial agreement. 6 pages. Her signature on the last page, notarized and dated from the 5th year of their marriage. She remembered signing it. Of course she did. What she had not known, what no one in that room except Jacob and Nathan Cole had known until 3 weeks ago, was that the agreement's specific language, carefully reviewed and confirmed by Nathan Cole, classified Phoenix Hale Construction as entirely Jacob's separate property in the event of dissolution. Kalani had signed it during the period she was working the company's books, when she still believed she was a participant in the future Jacob was building. It had been presented to her as a mutual protection document, and she had signed it without a second thought. Because at that point in the marriage, she had no particular reason to read the details carefully. She had excellent reason now. Any divorce filing under Arizona community property law would find the company fully shielded. No claim possible. The exit plan she and Damien had been constructing for months had been built against a wall neither of them had known was there. But that wasn't the detail that made Kalani's composure finally collapse. Jacob spoke next in a measured, unhurried voice. Nathan Cole has reviewed the transfer records from the company account. The $180,000 moved over 14 months while you held signing authority. He paused. He's also reviewed the correspondence between you and Damien regarding the Scottsdale property, the purpose of those funds, as you stated it in writing, in your own words. Another pause. His assessment is in the second document, 3rd paragraph. I'll let you read it. She read it. The word Nathan Cole had used, after reviewing all evidence in full, was misappropriation. He had chosen careful legal language, but the meaning underneath it was plain to everyone in the room. Kalani's legs gave way. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly, as if each joint made a separate, quiet decision in sequence. She sank to the floor of the hotel lounge, her red dress pooling around her, both hands pressed together in front of her. There was nothing performed about it. It was simply a woman whose legs had stopped holding her up. Jacob. Her voice was barely a sound. Please, I know what I did. I know it. Please, just... She stopped. Started again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Jacob looked at his wife on the floor of a hotel lounge while the sound of a jazz quartet drifted under the door. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crouched down so he was at her level. Not close enough to touch, but level. He waited until she met his eyes. Kalani, he said, I loved you without condition for 9 years. Every day I went out to build something, I was building it for us. I want you to know that was real. Every bit of it was real. His voice remained steady, not cold, something quieter than cold. The tone of a man who has finished grieving something and is simply stating what remains. But you made a choice. You made it deliberately, and you funded it with what I built. And you planned to take the rest when you left. He held her gaze. So I made a choice too. And Nathan Cole has been executing it for 3 weeks. He stood. He buttoned his jacket, smoothed the front of it once with his palm. A small, ordinary gesture that somehow carried the full weight of finality. You chose a life without me, he said. I'm choosing a life without you. He turned and walked to the door. Elena was already there. She tucked the folder under her arm, looked at the room one last time with the honest, tired expression of a woman who has watched someone she once welcomed into a family make choices that cannot be recalled, and then she followed her brother out. Damian Cross had not moved. He stood exactly where he had been standing for the last half hour, in his expensive shoes, with his champagne flute, in the particular stillness of a man who has just discovered that every angle he'd calculated was wrong. He was looking at the empty space where Jacob had been standing. Jacob passed through the lounge doorway without a glance in his direction. Out in the corridor, the main hall was full of sound, music, conversation, laughter, a community gathered in good faith, completely unaware that the evening had contained something else entirely just off the main room. The world kept moving, as it always does. Jacob and Elena walked through the hotel lobby side by side without speaking. Through the glass doors, out into the Phoenix night. The desert air was cool at the edges now, and the sky above the city was enormous and dark and clear. Jacob stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He took one full breath. He let it out slowly. He didn't feel relief. Not yet. That would come. But slowly, over months, the way recovery comes. Not all at once, but in increments. Each one barely distinguishable from the last, until one day you realize you've been okay for a while and can't identify exactly when it started. For now, he simply stood under the Arizona sky with the night air on his face and his sister a step away. He had said what needed to be said. He had protected what he'd built. The rest, the legal proceedings, the paperwork, the unwinding of 9 years, was already in motion. He looked up at the sky for a moment. Then he walked to his truck. Jacob walked out into the night having done everything right, and what the next morning brought would close every chapter of this story that Kalani had hoped to keep open. Monday morning, Nathan Cole filed. By 9 a.m., the divorce petition had been submitted, and a motion to freeze all shared accounts had been granted, pending the financial review. By 11, Kalani had received formal notification regarding the misappropriation claim. By early afternoon, the post-nuptial agreement had entered the record. Jacob was at a job site by 7, same as always. A small residential project in South Phoenix. 3 homes for families he'd had on a waiting list for 2 years. He put on his work boots, said good morning to his crew, and spent the day doing what he had always done. Building. Kalani moved back into her mother's house within the week. The Scottsdale property, purchased with her transfers and Damian's matching contribution, was immediately entangled in the financial proceedings. What had seemed like a foundation for a new beginning was now a liability, a line item in a legal file that neither of them had anticipated having to explain. Damian's attorney, reviewing the documented paper trail that Victoria and Nathan Cole had assembled, advised him plainly that his position was weak and that cooperation was strongly preferable to contest. He agreed to settle. He was not, as it turned out, a man built for situations where the paperwork had already been done by someone else. The financial recovery, structured through the civil proceedings rather than a criminal filing, was written into the divorce settlement. Jacob had considered both options carefully. He talked it through with Nathan Cole over 2 long meetings and made his decision. Civil recovery. The money returned. The record established. The protection made permanent. He had no interest in a process that would devastate what remained of a family that had already been badly hurt by people making choices they couldn't take back. "You're being more decent than you have to be," Elena told him on the phone. "I'm being exactly as decent as I choose to be," he said. "That's enough." She let it go. She knew her brother. Between the post-nuptial protections and the settled recovery, Jacob walked away from 9 years of marriage with his company fully intact, his financial position restored, and his reputation in the Phoenix construction community entirely undamaged. Kalani had kept the affair quiet within the broader community, which meant that when she began, in the weeks after the gala, to characterize the marriage as something Jacob had made difficult, distance, control, emotional unavailability, she found the account difficult to circulate. The people who knew Jacob Hale knew him specifically. They had watched him work, watched him show up, watched him conduct himself with the same steadiness at a cookout that he brought to a job site. A version of Jacob that required them to forget all of that was simply not a version they could hold. The alternative account did not travel far. Ryan's situation resolved itself through the natural consequences of exposure. Damian Cross, navigating his own legal complications, stopped returning Ryan's calls. 2 colleagues in the property management industry became aware of the circumstances. Word had moved efficiently through the network that Nathan Cole operated in, and discretion was not something Damian had earned. Ryan's employer, upon learning the outline of what had happened, concluded that his continued presence was not in the company's interest. Ryan was let go. He came to his parents' house on a Sunday and tried to account for himself. He had assembled a list of reasons. He hadn't wanted to interfere between a husband and wife. He hadn't fully understood the scope of things. The money had been framed as something benign at the time. He delivered this explanation in the living room while Vivian sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, looking out the back window. When Ryan finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You had a chance to be a man," she said finally, still looking out the window, "and you priced yourself instead." She turned and looked at her son. "I know what that cost you now, and I know it's not enough to undo what you chose." She shook her head slowly. "Go home, Ryan. We'll figure out what comes next." "But not today," Ryan wept. Vivian did not. She had moved past weeping into the harder, longer work of deciding who she still was after all of this. Richard Brooks called Jacob 2 weeks later. He was not a man who made long speeches. He had 35 years at the post office, a faith he practiced quietly, and a code of decency that had been the actual structure of the Brooks household long before anyone else in it had thought to say so. He said, "I want you to know that none of what happened in that family had my blessing or my knowledge. I failed to see it, and I'm sorry for that." He paused. "You were good to us. I want you to know I see that." Jacob said, "Yes, sir. Thank you for calling. That means a great deal." After he hung up, he was in the kitchen, his kitchen, the house quiet the way it was now, the way he was learning to let it be. He stood for a moment. Then he looked up at the ceiling fan. It had been clicking for 2 years. He had always meant to fix it. He went to the closet, found his toolbox, carried a chair over from the dining room, and had it sorted in 20 minutes. A loose bracket, a stripped screw, something so simple he almost laughed at himself for letting it go this long. He stepped down off the chair and turned the fan back on. It ran smooth and clean, no sound at all except the steady movement of air. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and just listened to that. Then he made himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the table with the blueprints for a new project spread open in front of him. The house was quiet, and the foundation was sound. And what Jacob Hale built next would matter more than anything that had come before it. 14 months later, Phoenix Hail Construction was the busiest it had ever been. 2 significant municipal contracts, affordable housing developments in neighborhoods that had been waiting years for someone with the right credentials and the right community standing to take them on. An expanded crew, a second truck, and the company office, which had lived for 6 years in Jacob's spare bedroom, had been moved into a small commercial space on the south side of Phoenix. A hand-lettered sign hung above the door. One of his younger crew members had painted it on a Friday afternoon without being asked. Showed up Monday, already hung. Jacob had stood in the doorway for a long moment when he first saw it. He hadn't been able to say anything right away. He'd just nodded and gone in to start the day. The mentorship program had begun without ceremony the previous spring. 5 young black men, ages 19 to 24. 3 had come through a re-entry program. 2 had been referred by a pastor at the community church who said simply, "They need someone to show them it's possible." Jacob didn't create anything formal. No paperwork, no announcement. He just started showing up on Saturday mornings with those 5 young men on whatever active job site he was running, teaching them to read a level and frame a wall, pull a permit, interpret a blueprint, submit a bid. He paid them for their hours. He asked one thing in return: attention. Some Saturdays, someone spilled coffee across a set of drawings, and Jacob would look at the spreading stain and sigh in a way that made everyone within range start laughing before he even said a word. Some Saturdays, the morning got cold, and nobody wanted to be there, and he'd tell them, without drama, "That's the work." The work doesn't negotiate with the weather. Some Saturdays, one of them asked a question that stopped Jacob mid-motion. A real question, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and he would set down whatever tool was in his hand and take the time to think before he answered, because he believed young men deserved honest responses more than fast ones. He told them one thing consistently, at the start of nearly every session: build with your hands and your word. Those 2 things together, nothing that comes from them will fall apart on you. They listened. They were good at it, as young men tend to be when someone speaks to them without condescension and means what they say. Vivian Brooks called him on a Thursday morning in November. He was driving to a job site, the old pickup's heater working at roughly half capacity, the Arizona morning carrying that dry, particular cold that Phoenix gets in late autumn, the kind that surprises people who associate the desert only with heat. He almost let the call go. Then he saw the name. He pulled over. Her voice was quieter than he'd known it in 9 years of Sunday dinners. Not weak, Vivian was constitutionally incapable of weak, but worn in the way that time and hard reckoning wear a person down to something more essential. "Son," she said. She was quiet for a moment. He waited. I watched you become the kind of man who shows up," she said, "who doesn't make excuses, who builds things for other people and asks nothing back. And I watched you handle what happened to you with more dignity than most men would have found." Another pause. "I see what you're doing with those young men. I hear about it." Her voice steadied, came back to itself. "I want you to know I'm proud of the man who stood firm. Prouder than I know how to say." Jacob sat in the pulled-over truck on a quiet Phoenix street, with the engine running and his hand pressed briefly over his mouth. "Thank you, Vivian," he said. "That means more than you know." "Take care of yourself," she said. "That's all I called to say." The call was short. Neither of them needed it to be long. He pulled back onto the road and drove to the job site. Kalani and Damien had separated within 8 weeks of the gala. Without the secrecy, without the particular friction of something forbidden, the shared opposition that had given their connection its energy, What they actually had between them turned out to be thin. A woman chasing an idea of something better, and a man who had enjoyed being the destination, had discovered that neither of them was especially equipped for the plainness of just being with another person. The Scottsdale property had been sold as part of the legal resolution. Kalani was, by all accounts, living quietly. Jacob didn't carry that. It wasn't something he wished on her. It was simply something that had resolved itself in the way that things built on instability tend to do. Not with drama, but with a slow, inevitable settling into nothing. He met Isabella in the spring. She was an architect, brought in on one of the municipal contracts to consult on design specifications. She wore practical work boots to the job site and spoke plainly about what she didn't know, which Jacob found, after everything he'd been through, an almost startling quality. They had coffee 3 times before either of them called it anything. The 4th time, he told her, briefly, without drama, that the past 2 years had changed how he understood trust, and that he moved carefully now. She said she appreciated him saying so. She said she was in no hurry. Their relationship grew the way good things grow, slowly, with attention, without forcing the frame before the foundation was fully set. Jacob Hale, quiet, broad-shouldered, patient, with his calloused hands and his old pickup and the hand-lettered sign above his office door, was building again. Not because he had recovered, not because the pain had simply disappeared, but because building honestly, with his hands and his word and the full weight of his character, was not something that had ever required perfect conditions. It was simply who he was, and nobody had managed to take that from him. This story teaches us 3 things worth sitting with. First, before you sign anything with your name on it, a financial form, a joint account, a document your spouse sets in front of you and calls routine, read it yourself, or have someone you trust read it with you. Not because marriage requires suspicion, but because your name on a page has consequences that outlast the goodwill that was in the room when you signed it. Jacob's protection came from a document Kalani never read carefully. That is not a love story detail. That is a practical one. Second, the people who stay quiet while someone you love is being harmed are not neutral. Silence is a choice, and it has a cost. If you have ever watched something happen in a family and said nothing because it wasn't your place, this story is worth thinking about. Ryan didn't raise a hand against Jacob. He simply folded his and looked away. The damage was the same. Third, and this one is for the grandmothers, the aunts, the women who have spent decades watching the good men in their families work without recognition. Say it while you can. Vivian's phone call meant more to Jacob than she probably knew. If there is a steady, decent man in your life, a son, a grandson, a neighbor who shows up without being asked, call him this week. Not a long call, just, I see you. I'm proud of you. That takes about 45 seconds. It lasts considerably longer. This story was written by a human, with AI as a companion. It was born from a simple wish, to awaken the belief that kindness still exists, and no matter how many trials life brings, there are always moments of justice and quiet miracles waiting for those who deserve them.